Weigh in on our Facebook page at facebook.com/C-SPAN. Live on C-SPAN 3 coming up momentarily, a news conference led by Senator Harry Reid and other members of the Senate Democratic leadership. And Representative Nancy Pelosi will hold a news conference at about 12:45. That will be live on C-SPAN 3. Speaker Boehner now on the floor of the House. Live coverage here on C-SPAN.
Park Service. And I...
Conroy. Let us pray. Loving God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. We give you thanks that you have given to us the goals of justice and the designs of freedom, and that these are our heritage as Americans. Bless the members of the People's House with the understanding that it is their work to develop the strategies and the plans for achieving those goals, and the trust to know that your Spirit is with them in their work. Grace this assembly with the resolve to be faithful in its tasks, responsible in its actions, and fervent in its desire to serve a nation which, so many hope, will live beyond the current difficulties into an ever greater realization of both justice and freedom. May all that is done today be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Chair will entertain up to 15 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the President's failure to negotiate is unprecedented. Yesterday, he finally invited congressional leaders to meet at the White House, but no progress was made. The President instead issued an ultimatum telling Congress that he is not willing to negotiate. Our nation is quickly approaching a deadline where we will no longer be able to pay our bills. This morning I received a 6-page memo from the Treasury Department outlining the disastrous impacts of defaulting. Every American family knows the consequences of exceeding the maximum on our credit cards. Responsible Americans do not send white papers of warning of a crisis. We find ways to reduce spending so we can spend within our means. It's time for the President to take his responsibilities seriously. The only way to make progress is to sit down with congressional Republicans and find a common-sense solution. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the many unemployed Americans who are looking for work, people who need a fair shot at entering the workforce so they can earn a living for themselves and their family. It's a travesty that the same partisan gridlock that shut down the government on the American people has also kept us from passing a bipartisan jobs bill this Congress. Government shouldn't be closed for business. Hardworking Americans deserve a government that works overtime to create jobs and promote a strong economy. The families I represent deserve better, and the American people deserve better. This Friday, I'm hosting a job fair at South Suburban College in my district. Over 50 employers will be on hand to offer jobs to individuals looking for work. I know they'll be impressed by the talented men and women we have in Illinois' 2nd Congressional District. Enough with the distractions. Americans want jobs. Businesses want to create jobs, and it's time that Congress did its job and passed legislation to get Americans back to work.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of House Resolution 3232, the Support Our Armed Forces Act. As a member of the House Armed Services Committee, I'm pleased to introduce this bill today with Congressman Cook of California. This common sense piece of legislation makes sure that all employees of the Department of Defense work and get paid during the government shutdown. Specifically, the Support Our Armed Forces Act extends pay to the National Guard, reservists, dual service technicians, and all civilian Department of Defense employees and contractors during this period of time. Indiana's 2nd District is home to Grissom Air Reserve Base in Miami County. Since October 1st, reports state that over 600 full-time civilian employees and Air Force reservists have been furloughed at Grissom Air Reserve Base. I think it's unfair and unsafe for Congress to jeopardize employment for these very individuals who devote their lives to fight for the continued security of this country. This bill provides essential support for hundreds of hardworking Hoosiers and Guardsmen in Miami County to guarantee the readiness of that base. Congress has an obligation to protect this nation, to support the men and women who wear the uniform bravely and work behind the scenes to provide equipment, training, essential support, and armed services. Thank you.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker, and revise and extend my remarks.
Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent?
Mr. Speaker, members, here we are, day 4 of the government shutdown, all because the Republican majority didn't get their way on a bill 3 years ago. They're so obsessed in the fact that eliminating the Affordable Care Act that they're willing to risk the functions of the United States government just to prove a point. It's really amazing and yet so sad. And now that we've seen the polls and realize the American people don't support what they're doing, their response is to pass a few bills to only reopen a few agencies within the government. Again, amazing. We need to open the whole government, and yet congressional Republicans seem to care about the consequences. They don't care about the consequences of the shutdown, even though they're significant. Thousands of people are furloughed. Critical programs and services across the country have been shuttered, and all because congressional Republicans are in denial of the Affordable Care Act. It's the law of the land and has been for 3 years, and has survived 42 legislative attempts to repeal it. It's time to move on. This is not a serious, responsible way to run the United States of America, and you know it. Stop playing games and pass a clean, continuing resolution. And I yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair would ask that all members use the proper form in asking to be recognized for 1 minute. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. You know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I'm going to show you some pictures today. This is a picture of the veterans, World War II Veterans Memorial being shut down. I want to find out who ordered these signs, because, you know, these were up the very next morning, and plus what, you know, maybe a Chicago sign painter that got this order, who gave him the order, and where we got all the barricades. Here's another one. This is a park in Washington, D.C. You can see the kids and stuff playing. It's got a sign that is shut down. So these things are normally open air. They're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, but yet now they're closed. I wonder if the golf courses on our federal property and our military bases are closed. Doesn't look like they are right now, but we'll see if we can't get them some barricades.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Massachusetts seek recognition? The gentlewoman is recognized without objection.
Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday, despite the GOP's best efforts, health care exchanges across this country opened. In the first 24 hours, healthcare.gov was visited by 4.7 million visitors. In Massachusetts, where we've had an exchange for years, thousands began the process of signing up for expanded care. Yesterday, in one of the local papers in my district, the Lawrence Eagle-Tribune, a reader wrote about the benefits that people are already enjoying under the Affordable Care Act. This grateful parent stated, quote, "I have been happy with Obamacare. For the past 2 years, my 2 recent college grads have been on my insurance. We have saved over $4,000. Originally, one was kicked off our plan at age 22. Republicans say young and healthy kids do not need insurance. They are wrong. One of our children was hit by a car walking, and the other had gallbladder surgery. The hospital bills were over $50,000. It is evident that families all over this country are grateful that their loved ones will have access to affordable health coverage. To my colleagues across the aisle, please listen to them.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'm here to say enough is enough. The President and this administration are manipulating the shutdown to intentionally hurt as many American families as possible, and that is simply wrong. My home state of Arizona has many national parks and beautiful scenic views, most importantly the Grand Canyon, the gem of the National Park Service. It should not be forgotten that these belong to the people. Though the House passed H.J. Resolution 70, Open Our National Parks and Museum Act, by a large bipartisan margin, the Senate is refusing to act on it, which is why, in true Arizona fashion, the Arizona Game and Fish Commission offered to the National Park Service their own solution, which is to include their own game and fish resources to keep open our national parks, including Lee's Ferry, the gateway to the Colorado River, the Grand Canyon, and the very symbol of Arizona. On behalf of the people of Arizona, I urge the National Park Service to get out of the way. Let residents, let Americans, let everyone back into their parks. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the President. While a member may engage in criticisms of policies of the President's, remarks may not include those personalities. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard from our Republican colleagues that Democrats don't want to compromise, that the President doesn't want to negotiate. You know, I read something on the Internet this morning that sort of describes the type of negotiation the Republicans want to have with us. It goes something like this. Can I burn down your house? No. How about just the second floor? No. How about the garage? No. Well, let's talk about what I can burn down. No. You're not compromising. Mr. Speaker, this is what we've been going through. You want a budget for 6 weeks? Defund Obamacare. Delay Obamacare. Take away the individual mandate from Obamacare. Or please, just sit down with us and tell us what we can take away from 20 million Americans who need health care, and then we'll reopen the government. Let me say to my colleagues, if you would just stop trying to burn down the house, we can talk.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this week the Pay Our Military Act became law. It states in part, and I quote, "There are hereby appropriated for fiscal year 2014 such sums as are necessary to provide pay and allowances to members of the armed services, civilian personnel of the Department of Defense whom are providing support to members of the armed services, and contractors of the Department of Defense whom are providing support to members of the armed forces," end quote. Mr. Speaker, every single DoD civilian worker and contractor supports the armed services. Hence, as a matter of law, there should be no furloughs of any DoD civilian personnel and no payment delays to any DoD contractors. Yet, a DoD memo states, quote, "Of the Department's 800,000 civilian workers, about half will be furloughed," end quote. Mr. Speaker, that violates the Pay Our Military Act, and the Obama administration must immediately return all 400,000 furloughed DoD employees to work and pay all DoD contractors on time. It's the law. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I ask for unanimous consent Speak to the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite Republicans' conviction to defund, dismantle, and shut the federal government down, mind you, because they want to deny health care to millions of Americans, exchanges have opened across the country with overwhelming response. In fact, in my home state of California, Covered California, which is California's exchange, reported 5 million page views to their website by 3 in the afternoon, exceeding expectations. Now, women know that they no longer can be charged more for just being a woman. Victims of domestic violence can no longer be denied coverage for having a pre-existing condition. And insurance companies can no longer increase premiums to increase profits while delivering less health care to consumers. Mr. Speaker, the American people are tired of this. Hostage-taking is a deplorable tactic. Shutting down the government in exchange for denying health care for millions is morally wrong. Let's reopen the government. We should do it now. The American people deserve us to do our job to keep government functioning. That's our patriotic duty.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the American people deserve better. The American people deserve better than a federal government that is largely shut down, services curtailed, employees furloughed. They deserve better than a president who says he will not negotiate and a Senate that apparently cannot negotiate. Mr. Speaker, the House has sent multiple continuing resolutions to the Senate to fund government operations through mid-December. The Senate dismissed each one, including our request to establish a House-Senate Conference Committee to engage in dialogue, to discuss our differences, and yes, to work towards solutions. After all, compromise should not be a four-letter word here in Washington. But if the President won't negotiate and the Senate won't talk, so to paraphrase a recent military reader's statement, tell me how this act ends. Until they come around, we must all remain committed to ending this government shutdown and for fighting for fairness in the President's new health care law. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the short time that I've been here, I've had the honor of meeting many of my colleagues on the Republican side, and I've found them, of course, to be very honorable people. And in fact, I've had the solemn opportunity to pray with them. And they love their families, they love their country, they love their communities just like we do. And I would hope that we could both stand back in this issue, reopen the government, and find a way to compromise, to get to a compromise. I think that reasonable people can get there. And so I hope, and I pray for wisdom, that we are granted wisdom on both sides to step back, to take a look at what we're doing, and to see how many people are being hurt in our community around the country. This is not the way I think that we should be acting. I think we are better than this, and again, I pray for wisdom. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would wholeheartedly concur with the preceding speaker that we need wisdom, we need guidance, and we don't want to shut this government down, and certainly we don't want to play politics, at least many of us, with our constituent services. Sadly, we've seen too many pictures of that in recent days with the memorials and monuments being chained off. That's wrong. This morning, my staff and I came across a document from the Executive Office of the President, Office of Management and Budget, with a Q&A dealing with planning for agency operations during potential lapse of appropriations. The question, what if the cost of shutting down a website exceeds the cost of maintaining services? Answer, the determination of which services continue during an appropriation lapse is not affected by whether the cost of shutdown exceed the costs of maintaining services. Mr. Speaker, that gives me concern that, yes, indeed, the sites that we've checked on, like the National Park Service, NASA, E-Verify, and the Department of Agriculture, have been shut down for political purposes. That needs to stop.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, 43,000 El Pasoans are federal employees. This is the 5th highest concentration of federal employees in the nation. Many of them work at Fort Bliss. Others are Border Patrol agents or customs officers at the busiest ports of entry in the country. All of them are facing uncertainty because they are being furloughed or are working without pay. I have spoken to many of them over the past week, including Army officers who are worried about what this shutdown is doing to the morale of the soldiers they command, and veterans who are employed at William Beaumont Army Medical Center who cannot go to work to care for our wounded warriors. A woman whose husband must go to work but doesn't know when he will get paid provided this advice to us. Do your job just as my husband has to continue to do his. Mr. Speaker, the solution to this crisis is right before us. Bring the Senate-passed government funding bill to the floor. It will pass this House and the government will be open tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, please put politics aside and do what is right. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I've been wondering exactly why on Tuesday morning did the Senate and the President let the government shut down, start barricading monuments from our World War II veterans, stop the treatment of children with cancer at the NIH, all because they rejected our offer to fund the government and end the special congressional exemption under Obamacare. Mr. Speaker, late yesterday afternoon, I got the answer. We all got an email about the President's decision on how this exemption is going to work. Mr. Speaker, we all have to go and get the gold policy. Yes, Mr. Speaker, not the bronze, not the silver, the gold policy from the exchange. That's the only one we can get. You see, bronze and silver is only good enough for everyone else in the country. For members of Congress and members of Senate and their staff, it's gold or nothing. That's why this fight has been for a clean CR. No one wants to remove that exemption. Mr. Speaker, remove the exemption for Congress and their staff. Gentleman's time has expired.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, you win. You shut down the federal government. But now what? Do you know why you did it? You started with defunding Obamacare, then it went to delaying funding for a year, and the conscience clause added in, and then you went to repealing the Medical Device Act, then it went to delaying the individual mandate for a year, and making sure government does not contribute to our staff's medical insurance. By the way, you did that twice. Now, there's no mention of Obamacare, and it's cherry-picking what part of government will open. I ask you again, why did you do this? I am confused, Mr. Speaker, but what about the people whose lives you've been playing with? You can't tell them why you're doing this. End this brinkmanship and show leadership. Allow the House to vote on the clean CR. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition? Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the real issue here today is about the rights of the American people. You see, individual American citizens should have the same rights to exemptions as powerful corporations have been given. And members of Congress should comply with the same laws as everyone else, whether it be Obamacare or any other law of this country. And that, Mr. Speaker, is all that we have asked for. If the President would simply agree to give the people of this country the same relief that he has given powerful corporations, we wouldn't be shut down right now. House Republicans will continue our efforts to pass bills that reflect the American people's priorities and their rights and keep the government running. We hope that President Obama and Harry Reid will negotiate in good faith and join Republicans in our efforts to keep the government funded and protect the rights of the American citizens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise
to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent?
I do.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My heart is heavy because of the death of one of my dearest friends in Florida, Dr. Matt King Carter, the pastor emeritus of Mount Olive Baptist Church. He was an extraordinary theologian, teacher, missionary, and an exemplary servant of God. His wife, Pat, and the family know that heaven has been deliciously improved. Mac was a preacher's preacher, and I mourn with his many relatives and friends and the Mount Olive family. One of his favorite words was delicious. Our lives have been deliciously enhanced because of the profound Christian teachings of a son of Ocala, Florida, Dr. Matt King Carter. We talked politics a lot, and he would remind me always of the admonitions of Leviticus and Ecclesiastes. And I would remind this shut-down place that we have a responsibility to the least of us in this society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for a period of 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the House has acted once again to fund critical operations of the federal government. Last night, we adopted legislation that would provide funding for the National Institutes of Health and for reopening monuments like our World War II memorial. The NIH provides critical funding for work ranging from the treatment of traumatic brain injury suffered by our soldiers to cancer therapies for our children. NIH is the largest source of federal research funding for the important work in these areas at the University of Virginia in our Virginia's 5th District. This critical funding should not lapse because the Senate Majority Leader refuses to come to the conference table to work out a reasonable spending agreement for the federal government. This critical funding should not lapse because the Senate Majority Leader insists on protecting health care waivers for Washington special interests while leaving Virginia families in the cold. The critical funding should not lapse because the Senate Majority Leader insists on protecting special health care subsidies for members of Congress while leaving Virginia families to pay the price. I urge the Senate to come to the conference table today. Let's get this done. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise to say to my Republican friends, the issue is not whether you are winning or losing this debate. The American people are losing. This is day 3. We ask you again to be reasonable. Let's reopen the government, and then let's get our leadership from both parties and both chambers into a room and not come out until they have a bipartisan agreement to fund the government in a responsible manner. Remember, Democrats, for the purpose of opening this government, have agreed to the Republican level of discretionary spending, $986 billion. That's the Republican proposal. And Democrats, including the President, have agreed to this level of funding through November 15th. The votes are on this floor right now to pass the $986 billion CR right now. Prove that I'm wrong. Speaker Boehner, leadership requires that you say no to those who want to obstruct and shut down the government. You must say no to them and let us vote up or down a clean, continuing resolution.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, at 12:01 a.m. this past Tuesday morning, I attempted to sign up for Obamacare. It's now been 60 hours, and I've still not been able to successfully navigate the online marketplace. Error message after error message, failed security standards, and 60 hours on website hold for just this one Kansan. It is clear Obamacare is failing. An embarrassment, particularly for the former Kansas governor, who is now in charge of Obamacare, but of course refuses to live under it herself.
My office recently spoke with one of the insurers in Kansas who told us that not one of the 365,000 uninsured Kansans successfully signed up for insurance on the Obamacare exchanges the first day. Although Senator Harry Reid and all the Senate Democrats, Kathleen Sebelius and the President himself refuse to live under Obamacare, the rest of America doesn't have that privilege. This is yet another example of why we need to get rid of Obamacare. It's unpopular, unaffordable, and unworkable. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
Seeking unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise the consent motion.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the time that President Obama was first inaugurated, it was clear that to most Americans that we had a crisis in the health care system. The cost of premiums was skyrocketing every year. Millions of American families did not have health insurance, and many of the health insurance plans that existed were inadequate, providing coverage that was essentially useless when someone had a serious health problem or a pre-existing condition. Our seniors enrolled in Medicare were in many instances paying hundreds of dollars each month for prescription drugs. Now the Affordable Care Act, in immediate effect, addresses this crisis. Already, the Affordable Care Act has permitted millions of Americans to visit a primary care physician without co-payment, prohibits insurance companies from discriminating against people with pre-existing conditions, and now parents are keeping their children on their health insurance plans until they're 26 years of age. As of Tuesday, across our great nation, people without health insurance are at long last have the ability to enroll in health care exchanges. The Affordable Care Act, it's the law of the land. And I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute, unanimous consent, and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are granted the power of the purse strings here in Congress, so we are right and reasonable by using that power. Yesterday, the House led and acted responsibly by providing another plan, yet another plan, to get parts of this government back open again. We provided funding to the NIH, which provides essential life-saving treatment and research to families who have received the worst news possible, that their family member, their child, may have pediatric cancer that needs a cure. And I urge the Senate and the Majority Leader, Harry Reid, to bring this up for a vote in the Senate immediately. We provided funding to the District of Columbia, which is part of our stewardship. Today we will once again vote to keep the promises to our veterans, and we will vote for the funding for National Guard and reservists. These are all issues that we all agree on, depending on where you are sitting, Republican or Democrat. The right thing in this situation is to provide funding and reopen the government. It's time for us to act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Because some in Washington insist on putting ideology ahead of common sense, we are in the midst of a government shutdown that will hurt real people in my state of New Hampshire. Shutting down our economy, our government hurts our economy. It hurts job creation. It hurts our veterans. It hurts small businesses. And it hurts middle-class families. We owe our constituents much, much better than this. Like Joe, who called my office this morning from Afghanistan. The line was a bit crackly, but this is Joe's message to me today. Support access to affordable health care for all Americans and open our government. Joe said to me this morning, I am over here working hard for my family and my country. Please, I'm asking you to do the same. So, Joe, today we owe it to you. Let's gather together and pass a responsible bill that will fund the government.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
Our attention on the needs of our country. Thank
Gentlewoman's
you,
time has expired. The members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, on September the 11th, 2001, Lieutenant Colonel Rolando Aguilar was already in the cockpit of his F-16 at Ellington Field in Houston, Texas. He was a member of the Texas Air National Guard. He was in his cockpit when he heard the sound of scrambling horns, alerting him to fly a mission. He and his wingman took off, and they headed east. And they intercepted Air Force One over the Gulf of Mexico and protected the former guardsmen from their unit from any possible attack. They stayed guarding him and flying next to Air Force One until they were relieved. Yes, it was President Bush. The Air National Guard was the first, according to them, the Texas Air National Guard was the first to be in the air on September the 11th. The members of the Guard and Air Force Reserves, and Mr. Speaker, I was a member of the Reserves at the same time President Bush was a guardsman at the same unit. Kept them flying. Keep them.
Gentleman's time has expired.
We need to keep them funded, keep the reserves funded.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We hear a lot from our Republican friends about funding for NIH and these pediatric research programs where dozens of children can get cancer treatment, and they make a big deal about it. On our side, we want to make sure every child in the United States has access to health care in case they get cancer. We hear from the other side, we want to open the World War II memorial so that veterans can have access to the memorial, but if that veteran's spouse or that veteran's child may have cancer or not have health care, we're saying as Americans, we should cover every American. Isn't that what they fought and died for? Justice for all and health care justice for all? And we hear from the other side, they're shutting down the government. I was against the Iraq War. The Iraq War was unaffordable. The Iraq War was unpopular. 58% of the American people were against the Iraq War. Democrats didn't shut down the government. Use the political process, which we did, and won the House back in 06.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman's time has expired.
That's how you govern in a democracy.
The gentleman's time has expired.
You govern in this country through a political process, and you wrap yourselves in the flag.
The gentleman is not in order.
You wrap yourselves in the flag, and then you don't.
The gentleman is no longer recognized. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I would like to acquaint you and my colleagues with Mr. Butch Matthews, a 61-year-old former small businessman from Little Rock, Arkansas, who used to wake up every morning at 4 a.m. to deliver canned beverages to retailers before retiring in 2010. A lifelong Republican, he was heavily skeptical of the Affordable Care Act when it first passed. I did not think Obamacare was going to be a good plan. I did not think it would help me at all, is what he said. But after a little research, he has now found out that he can get a better plan than he already had and at the same time save $13,000 a year. When he was asked what would he say to people who are skeptical about the plan, Mr. Matthews says this: I would tell them to learn more about it before they start talking bad about it. Mr. Speaker, he is still a real strong Republican, but he says, I'm very happy this came along.
Time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle say that they want to keep the government open. Well, it's simply not true, Mr. Speaker. Look, let's face it, the Republicans are in charge of this House. It's Speaker Boehner and the Republican leadership that are that shut the government down. They could simply bring up the Senate resolution that would keep the government open at any time now, today, or any time, and the government would reopen. So I don't want to hear this constant rhetoric that, oh, the Republicans want to keep the government open. It's simply not true. They are in charge. They have the responsibility. Speaker Boehner has the responsibility to bring up a clean resolution that would keep this government open. Now, I've heard that our appropriators, and you listen to, to Nancy Pelosi, they have said that we have agreed to the government spending levels of the other side of the aisle. So that's not the issue here. There's no issue anymore about how much we're going to spend. It's simply that the Republicans want to close the government down because of the Affordable Care Act. It should not be linked in any way. If anybody suggests this is not a problem, 22% of the gross national product is dependent upon the federal government. This is having a negative impact on our economy.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Speaker, open the government again.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 370, I call up the bill H.R. 230, a bill making continuing appropriations during a government shutdown to provide pay and allowances to members of the reserve components of the armed forces who perform inactive duty training during such period, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill 3230.
H.R. 3230, a bill making continuing appropriations during a government shutdown to provide pay and allowances to members of the reserve components of the armed forces who perform inactive duty training during such period.
Pursuant to House Resolution 370, the bill is considered read. The bill shall be debatable for 30 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Young, and the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Visklosky, each will control 15 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker,
gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 3230, and that I may include tabular material on the same.
Without objection, so ordered.
And Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Pay Our Guard and Reserve Act would fix a simple drafting error that existed in H.R. 3210, the Pay Our Military Act. The bill was intended to appropriate funding so that all of our service members, active duty, Guard, and Reserve, will receive their paychecks on time and without interruption during the government shutdown. Throughout the year, annual training, which occurs for 2 weeks a year, and inactive duty for training, which is commonly referred to as weekend drill. While H.R. 3210 appropriated funding for pay and allowances for service members who perform active service during the shutdown, it mistakenly omitted pay and allowances for performing inactive duty, training, or weekend drill. This was a simple technical drafting error in the legislation. I've heard from many concerned members requesting that we address this issue as quickly as possible to prevent any lapse in pay for our Guard and Reserve members during the shutdown. This bill would correct that and ensure that all of our service members receive their paychecks on time, including for time served on weekend drill. The Pay Our Military Act passed the House unanimously, and I believe this bill should have broad bipartisan support as well. And thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Indiana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly want to thank the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee as well as the chairman of the full committee for all of their good work on the Appropriations Committee. And it is not out of disrespect that I rise in strong opposition to this legislation. We are piecemealing, destroying the government of the United States, including the defense and the ability to defend ourselves of this nation. While we would suggest today that we are solving the problems at the Department of Defense, I would ask the question, what about maintenance of the existing equipment needed for readiness? Not in here. What about procurement for new equipment that is being eaten up in Afghanistan? Not in here. What about research and development to keep technological superiority of our forces so we are never in a fair fight? Not in here. What about maintaining facilities where these personnel live, where they work, where they serve our nation? Not in here. What about the commissaries? Not in here. I recognize that yesterday in Europe, the Army Chief of Staff said that this shutdown is impacting significantly day-to-day operations and forcing the military to cut training. There was an additional announcement today by a particular company, Sikorsky, that said they have slowed production of the Black Hawk helicopter now that federal contracting inspectors have left their post on furlough because of the shutdown. Same federal employees at Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford are also on furlough, delaying the delivery of engines and spare parts. And I reference the good chairman of the subcommittee on defense appropriations, and Mr. Rogers, who is chairman of appropriations. About 2 weeks ago, I noted on this floor that in Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 7, it says that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. It doesn't say anything about partial, temporary, continuing resolutions. It is time that the Congress of the United States begins appropriating. I'm here as an appropriator to talk about fiscal policy, but our process has been usurped by those who have a particular social agenda. It's called the Affordable Health Care Act. And I just want to reference 2 incidents that I've been involved in the last 10 days that I am appalled that we have shut the government down over this fight. The first is a meeting I had with a constituent of mine in Maryville, Indiana. Gentleman has worked hard all of his life, an independent contractor. Their family had insurance through his wife, who worked for a small medical practice that was purchased. She was relieved of her position, not because she was a bad employee, but because of consolidation. Thereafter, of course, you know how this story turns out. She contracts cancer. My constituent is in my office in the last 2 weeks because they are foreclosing on this house because they're broke. And we're arguing about this. But what infuriates me and profoundly disappoints me is I'm getting on an elevator across this aisle at about 1 o'clock in the morning this Tuesday, and one of my colleagues gets on that elevator, and my colleague was gleeful and happy and cheery because my colleague had called their state exchange at 12:30 a.m. in the morning, and for some reason no one answered the phone and the system didn't work. Why do you think people are calling that number? They need health insurance. Gleeful that government didn't work, and that's before we shut it down. What have we come to here? We have the best country in the world. It's time we start running it again. I'm opposed to this piecemeal approach, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the Appropriations Committee Chairman, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank the Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding this time. This very distinguished chairman of this subcommittee has rendered invaluable service to this nation and this body, and certainly this committee, and I thank him for his wonderful service over a long period of time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the brave men and women of our military who stand at the ready to defend this homeland. This legislation will provide the men and women of the National Guard and Reserve with due compensation for their service, on time and in full, throughout the government shutdown. Our intention with the Pay Our Military Act was to support all of our men and women in uniform. This legislation merely fixes a technical drafting error to amend that. Once again, I believe this is an important action to get us on the path toward ending this crisis. This bill underscores the need to sufficiently and appropriately fund the entire federal government to preserve our national security and get the nation back on a stable economic footing. The House and the Senate must work together to flip the switch on this shutdown, not only for our troops, but for everyone who calls this nation their home. It's our responsibility as members of Congress to take care of our troops, just as each of my colleagues in this body voted for the Pay Our Military Act. I hope they'll do the same today to correct that act. Mr. Speaker, the gentleman from Indiana, my friend, mentioned in his remarks about the other aspects of the federal government that needs to be back in operation. I could not agree with him more on that. However, the route out of this mess, if you call it, is for the Senate to appoint conferees. The House authorized and appointed conferees 2 days ago. We're waiting on the Senate to do the same. They appoint conferees. We can work out the differences between the two bodies, as is the time-honored tradition of this place, and solve the shutdown problem. So I asked the members of the other body to go ahead and appoint conferees. Let's start talking. We can solve this problem. So far, they refuse to even talk. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I'll recognize the gentlewoman from Minnesota, member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, for 2 minutes.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my Republican colleagues are once again bringing a bill to the floor in response to the terrible news coverage on their shutdown. Now, I am very confident every single member of the House of Representatives supports our Guard, Reserve men and women. And we all want them to receive the pay that they've earned. And we can just do that really quickly by passing a clean CR to fund the entire federal government and put an end to this GOP shutdown. But Republican leadership isn't serious about stopping the shutdown. We all know that this bill is not a solution, it's just a distraction. For example, this bill claims to support military pay during the shutdown. However, while this bill does provide them a paycheck, it fails to provide them the materials essential for doing their job. Let me give you examples of a few of the things that it doesn't fund. It doesn't fund the maintenance of existing equipment, and we need that for readiness. The procurement of new equipment if something needs to be replaced in order to continue a training drill or to be fully prepared. Research and development to keep the technology superiority of the U.S. forces. And then, as the ranking member pointed out, keeping the facilities and maintenance moving forward. This bill fails to ensure that our servicemen and women will have the equipment and other support materials that they need. And it certainly won't ensure that our other federal law enforcement at the FBI or the DEA are paid even as they continue to work to keep America safe. Mr. Speaker, this Republican government shutdown needs to end. The entire government needs to be funded. The American people don't want the Tea Party picking winners and losers, deciding what government services are necessary. So let's do what's right for the American people and pass a clean, continuing resolution to fund the entire federal government. And, Mr. Chairman, I would like to add for the record, along with my statement, the Minnesota Air and Army National Guard government shutdown impact in its entirety.
Fired.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy now to yield 2 minutes to the very distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, an important member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, Mr. Rodney Frelinghuysen.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the chairman for yielding. In the family of public servants, our military and especially their families deserve special attention, especially during this government shutdown. We've spoken with pride many times about our active duty soldiers, sailors, Marines, Coast Guard, and airmen and airwomen, many deployed in Afghanistan and other challenging areas around the globe. I need not remind my colleagues that the men and women of the National Guard are just as vital to the performance of our military. They train, deploy, and they fight alongside their active duty brethren. Many of these men and women have completed multiple overseas deployments in some of these same dangerous areas. And they guard us here at home and meet the challenges of man-made and natural disasters, civil emergencies like Hurricane Sandy last year in New Jersey or the flooding in Colorado. Last year, the National Guard alone responded to more than 100 natural disaster missions. Mr. Chairman, this bill corrects a drafting error in the Pay Our Military Act signed into law last Monday. It is intended to appropriate funds so that all of our service members, active duty, Guard, and Reserve, get paid. It deserves our bipartisan support. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Would yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend. I thank the
Without objection.
ranking member. I thank the chairman of this committee and the ranking member of the full committee. And I thank the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee. There may be no other member that has as much respect as I have in working with the chairman of the Defense Subcommittee, and I thank him for his service. And all of us want to be helpful to the men and women that we care about who rise up and serve us with ever call as civilian soldiers. And so today I want to offer a solution. Rather than this bill, I would like for our leadership, the Speaker, to bring to the floor a clean bill to open the government. I want my National Guard in Texas, 1,900 of them, to be able to be paid. But I also want their families to have Affordable Care Act And I also want to make sure that they have the kind of infrastructure, maintenance of existing equipment and procurement of new equipment, research and development, facilities maintenance, commissaries in the United States. And so I hear that there are 20 or 30 or 40 Republicans ready to vote on a bill that will open the government.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
To serve our National
Guard. For what
Guard.
purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arkansas, another member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for the time. I rise in support of the resolution. It's important for people to remember that the issue that we're speaking about goes right to the heart of readiness. Never before in the history of this nation have we been so reliant on our Guard and Reserve as now. I'm an example, Madam Speaker, of that reliance. It was my National Guard battalion that became the first to answer our nation's call after 9/11, when my gunslingers from Arkansas took the mission of the multinational force and observers in the Sinai, Egypt. And let me just add, on very short notice. We were able to go because we were trained and we were ready. This sequester has already taken its toll on our military. So to deny these Guard and Reservists their pay when they're making these sacrifices makes absolutely no sense to me. In fact, it's incredibly stupid for our country to be so short-sighted to try to make our political statements by denying the men and women of the Guard and Reserve the pay for their sacrifices. I urge support of the resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida